The notification came in at 11:04 at night, and I read it 4 times before I set my phone down. And then, I picked it up and read it again. Transfer received. $240. Sender, Margaret Ann Calloway. That is my mother's full legal name. My mother has been dead for 6 weeks. The kitchen looked the same as it always does at 11 at night. The overhead light I never use, the under cabinet strip that makes everything look slightly yellow, the counter where her notebook was sitting, had been sitting since I brought it back from her apartment 3 weeks ago. The rest of the apartment was dark. I work remotely and I keep strange hours, and the city outside my window had gone quiet the way cities do around 11, not silent but distant, like something heard through water. I sat there at the kitchen table with my phone, and I read it again. Transfer received. $240. Margaret Ann Calloway. The timestamp was 10:58 p.m., 6 minutes ago. The reference field had a string of characters I did not read all the way through. I read it up to the 4th character and stopped. There is a specific feeling when your brain encounters something it cannot process. It is not shock exactly. It is more like the thing your eye does when you try to read in a moving car. The words are there, you can see them, but they keep skipping away from meaning. I kept reading the notification. Transfer received. $240. Margaret Ann Calloway. I knew what the words meant individually. Together, they would not parse. I set my phone face down on the table. Then I picked it up. I'm going to try to explain this in a way that makes sense. I'm not sure it's possible, but let me start from the beginning. 6 weeks earlier, which is to say, 7 weeks before I am sitting in this narrative telling you this story, my mother died. Lung cancer, diagnosed 14 months prior, managed reasonably well until it wasn't. She died in the hospital on a Tuesday morning, and I got on a plane that afternoon and spent the next 10 days in her city, handling what you have to handle. Arrangements, her apartment, her things, the paperwork that starts immediately whether you are ready for it or not. My mother's name was Margaret. She was 68. She lived alone in the apartment she'd had for 11 years, in the city where I grew up but no longer live. I want to describe her accurately. She was practical and stubborn, and she made very good soup, and she had a gift for knowing exactly when you were lying to yourself, that she deployed without mercy. I moved to this city 2 years ago for a job, and I called her 3 times a week, and I visited 4 times a year, and I thought that was enough, and then she was gone, and I understood that it was not quite enough, and there is nothing useful to do with that understanding. There was no one else to handle the estate, no siblings. Her friends from her building were kind, but they were 70, and they were grieving in their own way, and they could not help with the forms. I am a technical writer. My job is documentation. I write instructions, I explain systems, I make complex things clear to people who don't have the technical background to understand them. I read everything carefully. I notice when language doesn't match what it's supposed to be describing. I had thought these skills would make estate paperwork manageable. They made it faster, maybe. Manageable is a different word. The estate itself was $11,400 in a savings account, a small amount in her checking, and her furniture and personal belongings, most of which I was donating. The money was not much, but it was everything she had saved over 50 years of working, and I was handling it myself because the sums involved didn't justify the cost of an estate attorney, or so I had decided in the first week. 3 weeks in, I was starting to regret that decision. But the money was close enough to closed. 3 more weeks of paperwork and it would be done. And I could breathe. And whatever portion of it I had mentally set aside for something she would have approved of, I still hadn't decided what. I could think about that after. That was the situation on day 1. That was what I was balancing when the notification arrived. My apartment is quiet in a specific way that I noticed more after she died. The building is well insulated. I almost never hear my neighbors. No footsteps above me. No music through the walls. When I moved in, I thought this was a selling point. After she died, the silence had a different quality. I could not call her. I could not pick up the phone at 7 in the morning because I'd had a strange dream and needed to tell someone. The absence of her voice and the absence of street noise from my apartment were not the same thing, obviously. but they were the same kind of silence. Total, not partial. A silence that was a closed door rather than just a quiet room. I noticed this, and I did not tell anyone because I could not explain it without sounding strange, and also because there was no one to tell without having to then explain the whole context. And I did not have the energy for that, and it was fine. I was fine. I am not asking for sympathy here. I'm trying to give you the picture of those first few weeks so you understand what I was carrying when I looked at that notification again at 11 at night, at my kitchen table, with her notebook on the counter behind me. The notebook. I need to tell you about the notebook. It was small, hardcover, spiral-bound, with a marbled cover in brown and cream, the kind you buy at a drugstore. Her handwriting was on the first page, a date from 2 years ago and the word, important, and a dash. I found it in the drawer of her nightstand when I was sorting her things. I did not know exactly why I put it in my bag. I had taken a few things, a photo, her good earrings, a ceramic mug she had forever, and the notebook was one of them. I brought it back to my apartment and put it on the kitchen counter, and I did not open it. It sat there. I walked past it every morning making coffee, and I looked at it, and I did not open it because I knew her handwriting was inside, and I was not ready for her handwriting. That is where things stood when I woke up on what I am calling day 1, which was 6 days before the notification. Day 1 was a Thursday. I had been back in my own city for 3 weeks by then. I was supposed to be returning to something like a normal schedule. Morning at the coffee shop on the corner, laptop and headphones, work until noon, then back to my apartment to handle estate paperwork in the afternoon. The coffee shop smells different before it fills up, something like old wood and espresso that becomes something sharper and louder once people arrive. I was there at 7:30, at the table by the window where I always sat, and I had my work laptop open and a cup of coffee I was using more as a hand warmer than a beverage, and I was reading through a documentation review that had been sitting in my inbox for 2 weeks. I got through about 4 pages before I closed it. The problem was not the work. The work was fine. The problem was a line in section 3 that read, "This process should be familiar to users who have completed the onboarding sequence." And the onboarding sequence had been removed from the product 6 months ago, and I was sitting there staring at this line thinking, who said this? Who looked at this and did not notice that the thing they are referencing no longer exists? And then I thought, I missed it. 2 weeks ago, I read this same document and sent it back with notes, and I missed it. I had been so focused on the sections I was revising that I did not read the sections I was not revising. And this line had sat there, pointing at something that didn't exist, and no one caught it until right now. I noted the error and moved on, but it stayed with me in a small way. Not a worry, just a loose thread. The thing you referenced that no longer exists. I didn't know yet that I would come back to that idea a lot over the next few weeks. The estate paperwork that afternoon was routine. Phone call with the bank to confirm the estate account setup. Confirmation from the death certificate office that the copies I'd ordered had been mailed. A form for the pension she had taken early that I was filling out for the 3rd time because I'd gotten one field wrong on both previous attempts, and I decided the field was badly designed, and I was going to include a note with this submission saying so. I included the note. I mailed the form. I cooked dinner. I watched something on television that I could not describe to you now. I went to bed at 10:30 and I slept adequately, the way I had been sleeping since she died. Not poorly, but not well. A sleep that was doing its job without conviction. Day 2, Day 3. The coffee shop. The documentation work. The estate calls. I was finding my way back to a functional schedule, and I knew this was good, and I knew I was supposed to feel good about it, and mostly, I just felt like I was going through the motions of a person recovering rather than actually recovering, which I told myself was probably how recovery felt from the inside and was not something to be worried about. On day 4, I had a call with my colleague Diane, who is the closest thing I have to a work friend. We've never met in person, she's in another time zone, we have been working on the same documentation team for 2 years, and we have a standing Tuesday call that we had kept up even through the weeks after my mother died, which was generous of her. She asked how I was doing. I said I was getting back to routine. She said that was good. We talked through a project update for 40 minutes, and then I got off the call and sat in my apartment in the 3 o'clock quiet and thought, that was fine. That was a normal work call. That was fine. I noticed that afternoon, for the first time, that I had not been sitting at my desk. My desk is near the window on the east side of the apartment. Late afternoon light comes in there at a low angle and hits the wall above the desk in a way I have always liked. Not golden exactly, more amber, and it moves slowly as the light changes. I had been working at the kitchen table instead. I had not consciously decided to do this. I had just been doing it. I went and sat at the desk for the rest of the afternoon, and the light did what it always did, and it was fine. Day 5 was unremarkable, except that I found, going through a box of papers I had brought back from my mother's apartment, a phone bill from 18 months ago. It was in a file folder labeled Utilities in her handwriting, and it was tucked behind the current phone bills. And I would have thrown it away, except that I have a habit, professional, automatic, of reading what's in front of me before I discard it. So I read it. The bill was for her landline and her cell phone, standard enough. But there was a third line on it, a data plan for a device I didn't recognize. A tablet maybe, or a mobile hotspot. The line had been added 14 months ago. It had been on her plan for several months and then canceled. I looked at it for a moment, and then I put it in a pile of things to follow up on, which was a pile I had been adding to all week. Old bills you don't recognize, subscriptions you have to cancel. The paper archaeology of a person's life. Normal. I moved on. I note this now because I did not think about it again for 11 days. Later I would think about how much was in that pile, and how easily each individual item could be explained as normal, as nothing, as just the ordinary clutter at the end of an ordinary life. Day 6. Thursday again, 1 week after I'd arrived back in the city. The coffee shop in the morning, the documentation review, which I had finally finished and sent. The estate paperwork, a call with the bank that went smoothly, a form that I mailed, dinner at 7, something on television. And then at 11:04 p.m., my phone buzzed on the kitchen table. Transfer received. $240. Margaret Ann Calloway. I read it 4 times. I set the phone down. I picked it up. I read it again. I want to try to describe what those first few minutes felt like accurately, without reaching for things that are not true. It did not feel like a haunting. It did not feel like a message from beyond. It felt like a document with an error in it. The kind of error that is impossible because it references something that no longer exists. My brain kept trying to process it and kept arriving at the same place. This cannot be right. Not because I believed in anything supernatural, but because the mechanics of the sentence did not work. A dead person cannot initiate a bank transfer. Therefore, this was wrong. Therefore, something had happened that I did not yet understand. I sat with that for a while. The kitchen was quiet. The notebook was on the counter. I did not look at it. Then I opened the notification all the way and read the full reference field. The first 4 characters were BETH83. My maternal grandmother's name was Elizabeth. We called her Beth. She died in 1983. My mother had used some version of BETH83 as part of every password I'd ever helped her set up. It was her pattern, a name she wouldn't forget plus a year that mattered. It was in every account. Her email, her bank login, her Netflix. Every single one. I looked at BETH83 on my phone screen for a long time. Then I put the phone face down on the table. I did not sleep much that night. I did not open the notebook. I lay in bed and ran through the explanations, because that is what I do when I am scared. I make a list. I sequence the problem. Explanation 1. Fraud. Pure coincidence on the reference code. A string of characters that happen to match a pattern I recognized. Banks get hit with fraud constantly. Someone, somewhere, had opened an account in my mother's name and used it to make a small test transfer to see if the account worked. This was the most likely explanation. The reference code was noise. Explanation 2. Someone who knew my mother's password pattern had accessed her financial information and used it. This was more specific, and therefore more disturbing, but it had the same resolution as explanation 1. It was fraud. I should report it. The bank would investigate. Explanation 3. My mother had set up some kind of automatic transfer before she died. A final gift, something she arranged and did not tell me about. This was less likely. She was not the type. She was practical about money in a way that did not include financial surprises. Also, she had been quite ill in the last months, and managing complex financial arrangements would have been difficult. Also, she was dead. Explanation 4. The reference code was not noise. It was there deliberately. Someone who knew BETH83 had put it there. Not for fraud, for something else. For me. I sat with explanation 4, and I knew it was the least supportable one. The one that required the most assumptions. The one a grieving person would construct because they needed to believe their mother had one more thing to say. I knew this. I also could not fully dismiss it, which meant I was either being methodical or I was being foolish, and I could not tell from the inside which one. I decided that both could be true at the same time. I decided I would report the fraud and also keep the reference code. I called the bank the next morning. The fraud line at my bank opens at 8. I called at 8:02, which felt like a reasonable amount of composure to demonstrate to myself. The automated system took 11 minutes to route me to a human being. The human being, whose name was Travis, was patient and thorough. He took down the transfer details. He confirmed the sending account information. He told me the account was under investigation for fraudulent activity and that my money would not be recalled and that the transfer had been flagged. He could not explain the reference code. He said the reference field is often filled with generated character strings. I asked how common it was for a fraudulent account to be opened in a recently deceased person's name. He said, "More common than you'd think. It's called ghost identity fraud. A lot of it happens in the window between death and when the death record enters the financial system. That window is typically 4 to 8 weeks." I thanked him and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about the word ghost. Then I opened my laptop and started a new document. This is what I do when I am scared. I know I said that already. I am telling you again because it matters. I cannot sequence grief into resolution. I cannot make a list that closes the wound, but I can make a list that closes a problem. And the transfer notification was a problem, and I was going to treat it like one. I typed, Day 7, things I know. Then I listed them. A fraudulent account was opened in my mother's name 11 days after her death. The bank confirmed this. The reference field of the transfer contained BETH83, which is a string my mother used as part of all her passwords. I typed, things I don't know. The list was longer. Who opened the account? How they had her information? Whether the reference code was coincidence? Whether there was more than one transfer or more than one account? What they actually wanted? I looked at the second list for a long time. Then I typed, what I'm going to do about it. And that list I left blank because I did not know yet. I spent most of that day doing estate paperwork and not thinking about the transfer, or doing a credible impression of not thinking about it. I called Diane at noon, not our scheduled call, just to talk, which I did occasionally, and I told her about the notification. She said it sounded like fraud. I said, yes, it is fraud. I called the bank this morning. She said, oh good, problem solved. I said, right. She asked how I was doing otherwise, and I said I was okay, and we talked about a project update for a while, and then I got off the phone. The problem, I thought as I set my phone down, is not the bank's involvement. The bank is involved. That's fine. That's correct. What the bank cannot explain is BETH83 in the reference field. And I cannot explain that either. And the two explanations, coincidence or signal, require me to be two different people to pursue them simultaneously, so I can only hold one at a time. And I keep putting down the coincidence explanation and picking up the other one, and I cannot figure out if that's intuition or grief. The reason I did not tell Diane the rest of it is that I couldn't explain it without sounding like a person who needed to be managed rather than listened to. And I was not in the mood to be managed. I was in the mood to think. I kept thinking. The second anomaly arrived on day 14, which is where things stopped being something I could almost explain. The fraud investigator, not Travis, a different person, someone from a dedicated fraud unit whose name I wrote down in my document as Sergeant Andrus, she asked me to call her that. She called on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk. The light was doing the thing I liked. I had started sitting there again, I noticed. She had a few questions, she said. Standard follow-up. I said, of course. She said, we've traced 3 outgoing transfers from the fraudulent account. One was the transfer to you. 2 others went to accounts we're still in the process of identifying. She said, the account was opened using valid identification, a scanned copy of your mother's driver's license and her social security number, both correct. I said, where would someone get a scanned copy of her ID? She said, that's the question we're working on. I said, and the reference code, the BETH83 reference. She said, we're looking at it. It may have been auto-generated by the platform. We're checking that. I said, has a scanned copy of her ID been found in her apartment? In her belongings? She said, that would be a question for the local police in your mother's jurisdiction, if there's an active investigation, which at this point there is not one there, only on our side. I said, okay. She said she'd call again if anything developed, and she thanked me for my cooperation, and that was that. I sat at my desk after she hung up. The light moved on the wall. I thought about what she'd said. Valid identification, a scanned copy, both correct. Whoever had done this had been physically in my mother's apartment, or had access to documents she kept there, or both. The social security number you can find sometimes through other means, data breaches, old documents, but a scanned copy of the ID is specific. That comes from access. Physical access to the apartment, or physical access to her at some point when she had her documents with her. I thought about her last year. She had been declining. I had been handling as much as I could remotely. Bills, insurance, calling doctors. But there were things I could not handle remotely. There were things that required someone to be there. She had mentioned on phone calls. A young man who helps me with the computer. Some IT issue she'd had. A software update that confused her, and someone had come to fix it and had stayed, apparently, as a periodic help. He fixed other things. He ran errands occasionally. She seemed comfortable with him. I had not paid much attention at the time. She was 68 and capable, and if she had found someone useful to have around that was good, that was fine. That was her decision to make. I thought about that now. I thought about valid identification and scanned copies, and someone with access to her apartment. Then I picked up the notebook. It was lighter than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed. How light it was in my hands. I opened it. Her handwriting was on the first page. A date, 2 years ago. The word important, and a dash, and a sentence I am not going to repeat here because it was private and it was hers, and it is not the part of the notebook that matters for this story. I turned to the second page. A grocery list, 7 items, her small, neat print. Third page, my own handwriting. From 4 years ago, visiting for a long weekend, the 2 of us at her kitchen table for an afternoon, going through her accounts one by one, and writing down the passwords in a system she would remember. I had written the accounts in a column on the left, and the passwords, or enough of each password that she'd remember the rest, on the right. My handwriting alongside hers. There it was on the third page of my dead mother's notebook. BETH83. My hand. My pen. 4 years ago. I sat there looking at it. Okay, stop. Think. The person who opened the fraudulent account had this password. Or at least the first 4 characters of it. Either they had found the notebook, which was in her nightstand, which would require being in her apartment with time to look through her things. Or they had obtained the password some other way, and the BETH83 in the reference field was coincidence. Or, and this was explanation 4, the one I kept putting down and picking back up, someone had put BETH83 in the reference field deliberately, knowing I would recognize it, knowing I would look. I sat there looking at my own handwriting. I had written those exact 4 characters, and I could not figure out if that meant something, or if I was a grieving person making meaning out of coincidence. I still can't tell you for certain, but I kept going. I reopened my document. I typed a new line. Who had access to her apartment in the last year? Below it, I wrote, me, her building neighbors, her doctor's home care nurse, twice a week from September, the young man who helps with the computer, building management, anyone she let in herself. I starred the young man who helps with the computer. Then I went back to my estate paperwork, and I did not think about it for the rest of the afternoon, because I needed to file a form by Friday, and the form required my full attention, and I could only do one impossible thing at a time. The next 9 days I worked. I did not investigate. I want to be clear about this. It was not courage, and it was not denial. It was calculation. I had made the report. The bank had the information. My job was to complete the estate paperwork before anything complicated it further, and I had 8 days left of processing time before the estate account would be ready to close. I needed those 8 days to go without incident. They mostly did. On day 17, I remembered the old phone bill. The data plan for the unrecognized device, added 14 months ago, canceled some months after that. I added it to my document. 14 months ago would have been roughly the same time she mentioned the young man who helps with the computer. I noted this, and then I noted that I was constructing a timeline from very thin materials, and that this was only useful if I did not mistake the architecture for the evidence. On day 19, going through her phone contacts, I had ported her number to a temporary line so I could receive calls meant for her while I closed out the estate. I started looking at the call history. Most of the numbers I recognized: doctors, her neighbor Ruth, my number, a few friends from her building. There were 5 numbers I did not recognize. I started calling them back in the evenings, telling whoever answered that I was calling on behalf of my mother's estate and was checking on any outstanding matters. 3 of the numbers were businesses: a pharmacy, a home repair company, a medical supply place. The 4th was not in service. The 5th did not answer. Day 20, the 5th number did not answer. I left a brief message. Day 21, the 5th number called back. It was a Tuesday evening. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop and my estate spreadsheet, and a glass of water I had poured and not yet drunk. The phone rang and I picked it up. A man's voice. Warm. A little cautious. He said, "Hi, I'm returning a call from this number?" I said, "Yes, thanks for calling back. My name," I gave a shortened version of it, "I'm handling the estate for Margaret Calloway. She had your number in her contacts. I'm just following up on any outstanding matters." A pause, then, Oh yes," he said. "I'm so sorry, she was wonderful. I used to help her out around the apartment. I heard she'd passed. How are you doing?" I said, "I'm managing, thank you." I said, "Did you have anything outstanding with her? Bills, arrangements?" He said, "No, nothing like that. Just, she was a great lady. She talked about you constantly, you know, her daughter in the city. She was real proud of you." I said, "That's kind of you to say." He said, "I'm sorry I can't help more with the estate. I hope everything goes okay. That process is a lot." I said, "Yes, it is." I said, "Can I ask your name just for my records?" He said, "Of course." His name was Daniel Marsh. I thanked him and said goodbye, and he said to take care, and that he hoped things got easier. I put the phone down. He sounded, there is no other word for it, genuine. The condolence was real. The warmth when he said she talked about you constantly was real. He sounded like exactly the kind of person my mother would have been comfortable having around. Patient, helpful, the kind of person who is good with older people who need a hand. I sat with the specific discomfort of that for a few minutes. A condolence that is real from a person who might be a thief. Both of those things being true at the same time. The condolence does not cancel the theft. The theft does not cancel the condolence. They just coexist in a way that has no clean category. Then I opened a new browser tab and I typed Daniel Marsh and my mother's neighborhood. He came up in 20 minutes. A small local business, handyman services, tech help, general repairs. Business page with a photo. He was smiling in the photo. He was maybe 35, An ordinary face. The kind of face you see every day and do not remember. He looked exactly like someone my mother would have trusted. The reviews on his page were mostly positive, spread over 3 years. Good communication, fair pricing, fixed what he said he'd fix. One 4-star review that mentioned he was sometimes slow to respond. And then a 6-month gap. No reviews at all between 8 months ago and 2 months ago. And one review from an account with no other activity, no name, no photo, posted 3 months ago. 1 star. Not recommended. That was all. No explanation. Not recommended. I looked at it for a long time. That's all I had. A notification, a password I taught my mother, a phone number, a condolence call, and a 1-star review with no explanation. I want to tell you I called the police. I didn't. I opened a new document and I started typing. What I had was circumstantial. All of it. He had access to her apartment. She'd told me so herself. The timing of the data plan on the phone bill could be a coincidence. The reference code could be a coincidence. He knew her password pattern because he had found the notebook, or because she had told him, or because the reference code had nothing to do with any of this. A 1-star review from an anonymous account was nothing. None of this added up to a case. None of this was actionable. What I needed was something concrete. A financial connection. Something that connected him by name to what the fraud investigator had found. The estate account. That was the place to look. I had been through the records, but not all the way through. I had gone back 3 years, standard enough for estate purposes. I had not gone back further. I had not looked at the investment account she'd had in her 40s that she'd cashed out years ago. Or so I'd assumed. I pulled the full financial history. I pulled it because I was being methodical. I was scared, and so I was being methodical, and this is what methodical looks like. You pull everything and you read all of it even when you are tired and your eyes hurt from the screen, and it is 10 o'clock at night and you would very much like to stop. At 10:45 I found it. A small investment account. Opened 18 months ago. An amount transferred in, not large, $4,000 from her savings, designated as a long-term investment. I had missed it in my initial review because it was labeled in a way that looked like a normal account, and because I had been grief processing and working quickly, and because, frankly, the 4-character password field in a fraudulent transfer had not yet told me to look more carefully at everything. I looked at the beneficiary field. The beneficiary was not me. The beneficiary was listed under a name I did not recognize. Martin R. Webb. An address in a neighborhood I recognized as being in the same part of the city as the address on Daniel Marsh's business page. The account had been opened 18 months ago. Daniel Marsh had been in my mother's life for approximately 14 months. I want to tell you I processed this logically and calmly. What actually happened is that I pushed my chair back from the kitchen table and walked into my bedroom and stood there in the dark for a few minutes. Not because I was falling apart, because I needed the room to think. He had been positioning for this before she died. The investment account, the beneficiary change, that was not opportunistic. That was not someone who saw an opening after a death and took it. That was someone who was watching. Someone who had been in her daily life long enough to see her health declining and to begin, quietly, systematically, moving pieces into place. The fraudulent account after her death was the end of the process. Everything else came before. He had been in her apartment, in her files, in her computer. He had been hired to fix her computer. He had been in it with her permission, and that meant he had had access to everything. Her documents, her IDs, her social security number, her passwords, her trust, her trust. I came back to the kitchen table. I sat down. The light above the counter was on, the under-cabinet strip that makes everything look slightly yellow, and the notebook was sitting where it always sat. Marbled cover, her handwriting on the first page. I did not touch it. I just looked at it. Here is the part I have not been able to say cleanly in any of the other ways I have tried to tell this story. It was not about the money. The money was almost beside the point. $4,000 in a fraudulent transfer and whatever else he had planned or already taken. The money was real and it mattered and it was my mother's and it was wrong. All of that is true. But the money was not the part that I sat with in that yellow-lit kitchen at 11 at night. What I was sitting with was this. She had a year with him around, maybe more, a year of trusting him, of letting him in, of mentioning him on phone calls in that way she had. The young man who helps me with the computer, as if she was slightly amused by her own need for help, as if she was charmed that help had arrived in such a competent form. She had been ill. She had been managing it with practical stubbornness, the same way she managed everything, and having someone reliable to call when the laptop misbehaved, or something needed fixing it was good, it was a comfort. I had thought, when she mentioned him, good, I'm glad she has someone around. He had been present for the last year of her life, for whatever portion of that daily, ordinary, quietly diminishing life she had shared with him when he came by. The ordinary dailiness of being a person, her kitchen, her routines, the specific way she had of talking to people she trusted, the comfort she let herself show because she believed he was worth showing it to. He was there for that. He chose to be there for that and to also be preparing, all along, to take from her. My mother died believing she had good people around her. She was wrong about at least one of them. That is not rage. I want to be clear about that too. There was rage in it somewhere, but it was not what I was feeling first. What I was feeling first was a specific grief with a specific shape. The grief of something given to the wrong person without consent. My mother gave him her trust. She gave him the daily texture of her last year. She gave him access to everything, her passwords and her documents and her time, because she believed he had earned it. He had not. He had been spending the whole time in a way she did not know. I thought about that for a while. The light moved on the wall. Then I picked up my phone. The estate attorney's name was Patricia Sousa. Her office was 20 minutes from my apartment, and I had found her 2 days ago when I started to realize I was in over my head. Before I found the investment account, before I knew how far over my head I actually was. I had an initial appointment scheduled for Friday. I called her office's after-hours line and left a message that I needed to move that appointment up if possible, and that the situation had developed in some ways I had not anticipated. Then I opened a new document. I called it Timeline. I started writing. The timeline I was building had to cover 18 months, and it had to be sourced. Not my impressions, not my interpretations, but documented facts with dates. The investment account. Date opened, amount, beneficiary listed. The data plan on the old phone bill. Dates active, device type if I could find it. The fraudulent account. Date opened, amounts transferred, reference code, account creation details from Sergeant Andrus's report. Daniel Marsh. Business page dates, review dates, the gap. The call history. Dates and duration of calls from her phone to his number. I had enough to see the shape of it. What I did not have was a link between Daniel Marsh and Martin R. Webb, the beneficiary on the investment account. Webb was either a real person, a relative, an accomplice, a name he used, or a fabricated identity. If I could link those two, the pattern went from circumstantial to documented. I worked until 2 in the morning, and then I stopped because my brain had stopped being useful and I needed to sleep. I did not look up the 1-star review again that night. I had read it once. Not recommended. Whoever had written that had been standing at a moment very similar to this one, with something they could not prove and no clear way to prove it, and had done what you can do, which is leave a mark. Say something happened here. I don't know if it helped them. I thought about them while I brushed my teeth, and then I went to bed. Friday came. Patricia Sousa's office was on the 12th floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. She was maybe 50, with reading glasses she kept setting down and picking back up, and she had a yellow legal pad on her desk, and a pen she was using to underline things as I talked. I talked for 40 minutes. I brought my laptop. I showed her the timeline document, the financial records, the business page, the review. She made notes. She said, "The investment account is the clearest documentation you have of pre-planned activity." She said, "The beneficiary name needs to be traced." She said, "The fraud investigator's case is the primary avenue here. If the bank can link the fraudulent account to a device or an IP address that matches Marsh's known locations, that does the work you cannot do yourself." I said, "Can I give all of this to Sergeant Andrus directly?" She said, "Yes, that is exactly what you should do." I said, "And the estate account, will filing this flagged?" She looked at me over her reading glasses. She said, "The account closure timeline will be extended. Yes. I sat with that. 3 more weeks had already become 5, and I could feel them becoming 7, 9, open-ended. The money I had mentally earmarked for something she would have approved of, still without a name. I said, "Okay." Patricia said, "I want to be clear that this may not result in a charge. The circumstantial case is suggestive. It is not airtight. If the fraud investigation does not find a direct link between Marsh and the fraudulent account, the most you may get is a civil matter and the return of whatever the account closure can recover." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you still want to proceed?" I said, "Yes." She wrote something on her legal pad and circled it and said, "Then let's start here." The call to Sergeant Andrus was on day 31. She listened to everything. She asked specific questions. She asked about the investment account beneficiary. She asked about the device on the old phone bill. She asked about the specific date I had found his name in the call history. She said she would need the full financial documentation and the timeline I had built. She said she would need me to send it formally, and she gave me an email address. I said, "Do you have anything new on your end?" She said, "Yes. 2 of the 3 outgoing transfers have been traced to accounts that have since been closed. The IP address used to create the fraudulent account has been identified. It is a residential address. They are in the process of confirming who resides there." I said, "Is it in the same neighborhood as this address?" I gave her the address from Daniel Marsh's business page. There was a pause. She said, "I can't confirm that for you right now." I said I understood. I sent her everything that day: the timeline, the financial records, the investment account documentation, Patricia Sousa's contact information, the business page link, the call history printout, every document I had. I attached it all and sent it, and then I sat back from the kitchen table and looked at the room. The overhead light I never use, the under cabinet strip, the counter, the notebook. I had been staring at it for days without actually seeing it. Now I picked it up and opened it. I had read the 3rd page, my handwriting, the passwords. I had not read the earlier pages. The first was her date and her word important, and her sentence I was still not ready to share. The second page was the grocery list. I turned past the 3rd page to the 4th and kept reading. Her notes were, I want to say mundane, but that word has the wrong feeling. They were ordinary. A phone number with a name written next to it, Ruth, her neighbor. A note about a doctor's appointment, just the date and the time. A sentence written in the middle of a page with nothing around it. Don't forget to ask about the supplemental coverage. A reminder, maybe. Just something she had written down to make sure she remembered. I read through 6 pages of it. Her handwriting, small and neat. The same handwriting she'd had my entire life. Recipes she was going to try. Written as a list of ingredients with no instructions because she kept the instructions in her head. A note about a book she wanted to read. The name of a street, just the street name with nothing else next to it. Her ordinary mind, going about its ordinary business. He had sat in her kitchen. He had seen these notebooks, this one or others. He had been someone she showed these things to, maybe, or just someone who was around while she wrote in them. He had watched her be a person, a complete, specific, ordinary person, with grocery lists and doctor appointments, and a sentence in the middle of a page that was only for herself. He had watched all of that and made his calculation. I closed the notebook. I left it on the counter. I did not put it away. Day 38. Sergeant Andrus called at 9 in the morning. I was at the coffee shop, my usual table, and I stepped outside to take the call because the shop was filling up and it was louder than I needed it to be. She said, "The residential address associated with the IP used to create the fraudulent account belongs to a Daniel Marsh." I said, "Yes." She said, "We're moving forward with the investigation." She said she could not give me specifics about what that meant procedurally. She said Patricia Sousa would be the right point of contact going forward for anything estate-related. I said, "What about the investment account beneficiary, Martin R. Webb?" She said, That name corresponds to an account opened using a secondary identity. We're working on that. I said, secondary identity? She said, yes, it's a pattern. People who do this kind of thing sometimes set up receiver identities in advance. I thought about that. A name made up and put in a form. My mother's trust, translated into a name that didn't exist so that the money could be moved somewhere she couldn't follow it. I said, okay. I said, is there anything else you need from me? She said, not right now. I'll be in touch. I went back inside the coffee shop, the smell of old wood and espresso. I sat back down at my table and put my phone in my bag and picked up my coffee, which had gone cold. I want to be precise about what I knew and did not know at that point because I think it matters. I knew the investigation was proceeding. I knew there was a documented link between Daniel Marsh and the fraudulent account. I did not know if there would be a charge. I did not know if the investment account money could be recovered. I did not know what had happened to any of the money from the transfers, whether it was recoverable or gone. I had handed everything I had to the people whose job it was to do something with it. What they did with it was not a problem I could solve. I sat there with my cold coffee and I thought, she would have been 70 next year. I had been saving up an argument for her, about a decision she had made 15 years ago that I had never quite agreed with. Small enough in the scheme of things, and I had been circling around the argument for years, getting close and then deciding there was no point. And now there was no longer an option. The argument was closed. It had closed before I thought it would. This has nothing to do with Daniel Marsh and nothing to do with the transfer notification. It is just one of the things I sat with in the coffee shop on day 38 with cold coffee while the morning crowd talked around me. When I got back to my apartment, I went and sat at my desk. The late afternoon light was hours away. The desk was just a desk, a flat surface with a laptop and a stack of papers I had sorted and needed to file. I sat down and opened the estate spreadsheet and I worked through it, systematically, the same way I had been working through it for 6 weeks. That evening, after dinner, I picked up the notebook one more time. I turned to the third page. My handwriting, BETH83, and the rest of the passwords I had written down 4 years ago on an ordinary weekend. Her at the table across from me, both of us trying to get her accounts into a form she could manage. I remembered that afternoon, the soup she made for lunch, the way she had watched me write the entries down, checking to make sure she understood each one, and her saying, I don't know why they make this so complicated, as if the passwords were an unreasonable imposition on a reasonable world. I thought about the reference code. I thought about it the way I had been thinking about it for weeks, circling. Either it was noise, and I had built everything on a coincidence, or it was a signal, and my mother had somehow arranged this final, improbable pointer in my direction. And both of those things could not be fully true, and neither could be fully dismissed. And I had decided not to pursue the answer because the answer could not be verified, and pursuing it would only keep me in a state of not knowing for longer. What I knew was this: there was a fraudulent account. There was a person who had been present in my mother's life and had taken from her, before and after she died. There was a documented connection. There was an investigation. I had found what I found because I had not put the phone down and walked away. Whatever had pointed me there, my own pattern recognition, BETH83 in a reference field, something my mother arranged, something no one arranged, I had followed it somewhere real. The rest I left open. I turned to the earlier pages. I read the grocery list. I read the sentence that was only hers, the one I am not going to share. I read the phone number with Ruth's name next to it and thought about calling Ruth, about whether I had been in touch enough, about whether the building neighbors who had known her for 11 years were doing okay. I had sent a card. It was not enough. I made a note to call. I read 6 pages. Her ordinary mind, her grocery lists and her reminders, and her small pieces of herself, written down for no audience but her own future self, the version of her who would need to remember the doctor's appointment, the street name, the supplemental coverage. She did not know I would be reading this. She did not write it for me. It belongs to me anyway. I closed the notebook and left it on the counter. I did not put it away. The kitchen was quiet. The under-cabinet strip made the counter look slightly yellow in the way it always did. The window above the sink was dark. Whether Sergeant Andrus would find enough, whether the charge would come, whether the money could be recovered, or the investment account undone. These were questions with answers I did not yet have, and might not have for months. They were real questions. I was not pretending they weren't. But they were the bank's questions now, and the attorney's questions, and the investigator's questions. I had done what I could do. I had built the timeline. I had found the shape of it. I had handed it to the people who could do something with what I found. What I could not hand to anyone was the thing I had also found in the notebook. The grocery list, the phone number, the sentence written in the middle of the page that was only hers. The afternoon 4 years ago at her kitchen table, both of us making something complicated manageable. The 3 calls a week and the 4 visits a year, and the argument I had been saving up and did not get to make. Those were mine. They could not be taken. They had never been in any account. I went to bed at 10 and I slept better than I had in weeks, which surprised me, and then did not.